I always knew my family had a favorite. It wasn't me. Chris, my younger brother by 3 years, was the golden boy. He always got the easy smiles, the warm hugs, and the endless second chances. Mom used to say he had a spark, whatever that meant. I figured it had something to do with the way he could charm anyone within seconds. His grin wide and effortless, his laugh contagious. Dad would slap him on the back and say, "That's my boy," even after he crashed Dad's car at 19. Me? I was the steady one. Ethan Hall, reliable, responsible, and perpetually in Chris's shadow. I was the guy who fixed the leaky sink when Dad forgot, who mowed Mom's lawn without being asked, who stayed after family dinners to help with the dishes. Not that any of it mattered. Compared to Chris's magnetic personality, I might as well have been invisible. Still, I thought I'd carved out a decent life for myself. I was married to Clara, a beautiful, quiet woman I'd met during a marketing conference 5 years ago. Clara wasn't flashy, but she was smart, composed, and had a wit sharp enough to slice through my occasional bouts of self-pity. We'd been trying to have a baby for over 2 years, with no luck yet, but I thought we were solid, stable, until that night at Mom's birthday dinner. The dining room was loud, as it always was when the Hall family gathered. Mom and Dad sat at either end of the table, grinning as Chris told some exaggerated story about a camping trip. I caught Clara laughing softly next to him, her cheeks flushed. It was such a small thing, her laugh, the way her hand lingered on her wine glass, but it stuck with me. Clara didn't laugh much these days, not like that. Not with me. "You okay, Ethan?" Chris's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, his grin aimed squarely at me. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired from work." Chris chuckled. Same old Ethan, married to his job. The table erupted in laughter, and I clenched my jaw, trying not to let it show. Clara gave me a fleeting glance, something unreadable in her eyes, before turning back to Chris. Later that evening, I caught a moment with Clara while she loaded dishes into the dishwasher. "You seemed like you were enjoying yourself," I said, leaning against the counter. She paused, looking at me over her shoulder. It was nice to laugh for a change. The words stung more than they should have. "You could laugh with me," Clara sighed, closing the dishwasher. "Ethan, don't do this. It was a family dinner, not a competition." "It's not about that," I began, but she cut me off with a look. "Good night, Ethan." I watched her walk away, my frustration mixing with something darker. I'd never considered myself the jealous type, but that laugh, her laugh with Chris, kept replaying in my mind. Over the next few weeks, things didn't improve. Clara became distant, spending more time out of the house. She claimed she was catching up on work or meeting friends, but I noticed her phone was always locked, and she didn't leave it lying around like she used to. Chris, meanwhile, seemed to be everywhere. Mom asked me to help him move furniture one weekend, and he spent the whole time cracking jokes about my old married man routine. I forced a laugh, but his words dug under my skin. It wasn't until the 4th of July barbecue that I started to feel like I wasn't just imagining things. The barbecue was at Mom and Dad's house, as usual. Chris was manning the grill, beer in hand, while Clara stood nearby, chatting with him. I watched them from across the yard, my stomach twisting. They were too close. Her hand brushed his arm as she laughed, and he leaned in, his smile too wide. "Ethan, you're burning the burgers," Dad said, clapping me on the shoulder. I blinked, realizing I was holding a spatula over the grill. The meat was smoking, blackened at the edges. "Right? Sorry." Dad gave me a puzzled look but didn't press. Later, when most of the family was inside, I saw Chris and Clara again, standing by the garden. They weren't touching, but their body language was too familiar. Clara's head was tilted toward him, her expression soft. Chris's grin was gone, replaced by something more serious. I took a step forward, but Mom called my name from the porch. When I looked back, they were gone. That night, as Clara slept beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I told myself I was being paranoid. Chris was my brother. Clara was my wife. They'd never, but the laugh, the closeness, the way she avoided my questions. Doubt crept in, whispering in the dark corners of my mind. I needed to know the truth. Suspicion is a cancer. Once it takes root, it grows, spreading through your mind until it consumes every thought, every moment of peace. I spent the next few weeks trying to ignore the gnawing unease, but it was always there, lurking in the background. Clara was slipping away from me, and Chris was everywhere. At family dinners, at Mom's house, even stopping by unannounced at our place. Every time I saw them together, it felt like a dagger twisting in my gut. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Started small, just little observations. Clara's phone, once left casually on the counter or coffee table, was now glued to her hand or tucked away in her purse. She was going out more often, always with vague explanations. "I'm meeting Jenna for drinks," she'd say. Or, "I have a work meeting at the office." Her tone was casual, but her eyes, there was something guarded in them. One night, I decided to test her. "Mind if I come with you?" I asked as she grabbed her coat. Clara froze for a split second, just long enough for me to notice. "It's just a work thing," she said quickly. "You'd be bored." "I don't mind. I could grab a drink nearby and wait for you." Her smile was strained. "Ethan, it's really not a big deal. I'll be back in a couple of hours." I nodded, but my heart sank as she walked out the door. The turning point came a week later. Clara had left her phone charging on the kitchen counter while she showered. I glanced at it, my palms sweating. I'd never snooped through her things before, but the doubt was eating me alive. I hesitated, then picked it up. Her phone was locked, but a notification had popped up on the screen. A message from a number saved as J. Can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Last night, she told me she was working late. Before I could think, I heard the water in the shower turn off. I put the phone down quickly, my heart pounding. That night, Clara was quiet at dinner, and I couldn't focus on a word she said. My mind was stuck on that message. Who was Jay? What had happened last night? I waited until she fell asleep before grabbing her phone again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened it using the passcode I'd seen her use 100 times. The messages from Jay were short but intimate. Compliments about her smile, flirty jokes, plans to meet. And then I found it. "Jay, do you think Ethan suspects anything?" Her response: "No. He's too focused on work to notice." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The next day, I began to put the pieces together. I checked Clara's calendar on the fridge against her messages with Jay. It was subtle, but there were overlaps. Nights she claimed to be working or meeting friends matched times she texted Jay about seeing him. But I still didn't know who Jay was. Then, one evening, I overheard her on the phone. I was in the living room when she walked into the kitchen, her voice low. "Yeah, I'll see you tomorrow," she said. "No, he doesn't know. I'll figure something out." I stood frozen, my fists clenched. When she hung up, I walked into the kitchen. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Clara looked startled, then annoyed. "Jenna," she said. "Why?" I studied her face, searching for any crack in her mask. "No reason." She shrugged and walked past me, but I saw her grip her phone tightly as she left the room. The next day, I decided to follow her. She told me she was meeting Jenna for coffee, but instead of heading downtown, she drove to the park on 7th Avenue. I parked a few spots away and watched as she got out of the car. A moment later, Chris pulled up in his truck. I watched, my stomach churning, as Clara walked over to him. He smiled, leaning casually against his truck, and she smiled back. They didn't touch, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. I took out my phone and started recording. When Clara got home that evening, I was waiting for her. "How was coffee with Jenna?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Good. We caught up on a lot." I nodded, biting back the anger threatening to spill over. "That's nice." I didn't confront her that night. I needed more proof, and I needed to be sure I could confront Chris too. The next few days were a blur of quiet rage and careful planning. I tracked Clara's movements, checked her messages when she wasn't looking, and kept my interactions with Chris cordial enough not to raise suspicion. Finally, during another family gathering, I saw it again, the look between them. It was subtle, but it was there. I pulled Chris aside when no one else was around. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice low. "Sure," he said, flashing his usual grin. "Outside." His grin faltered, but he followed me out to the porch. Once we were alone, I turned to face him. "What's going on between you and Clara?" Chris blinked, his smile vanishing completely. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," I snapped. "I've seen the way you look at each other, and I know she's been meeting someone." He held up his hands, laughing nervously. "Ethan, you're paranoid. Clara's your wife." "I'd never." "Save it," I said, cutting him off. "I have proof." For the first time in my life, Chris didn't have a quick comeback. There's a saying that the truth will set you free, but whoever came up with that probably wasn't married. The truth doesn't liberate. It wounds, it scars, it leaves you hollow. And when the truth is staring back at you in the form of your wife's betrayal and your brother's smirk, it feels like a death sentence. But I wasn't ready to lie down and let it crush me. Chris froze when I said the word proof. "Proof of what, Ethan?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying his usual smooth confidence. "You know what I'm talking about," I said, stepping closer. "Clara, the texts, the late-night meetings, and the baby." His face turned pale. "Baby?" I smirked grimly. "Oh, you didn't know she was pregnant? That's interesting. Almost as interesting as the fact that it sure as hell isn't mine." For a moment he looked like a trapped animal. Then he recovered, flashing me a weak grin. "Look, man, you're getting this all twisted. Clara and I are close, sure, but not like that. You're jumping to conclusions." "Am I?" I said, pulling my phone out of my pocket. I opened the video of their meeting at the park, holding it up for him to see. Chris's smile disappeared as the footage played. Clara approached his truck, smiling. He leaned in, saying something I couldn't hear, and her laugh rang out softly. It didn't matter that they weren't touching. The intimacy between them was unmistakable. He swallowed hard, glancing away. "Care to explain that?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Chris sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Ethan, I didn't want it to be like this. I swear, man, it just happened." "It just happened?" My voice rose, anger boiling over. "You slept with my wife, Chris. That doesn't just happen." He flinched but didn't deny it. The worst part wasn't even Chris admitting to the affair. It was the way he tried to justify it. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, his voice soft, almost pleading. "But Clara, she's been so unhappy, man. She needed someone to talk to, and I was there." One thing led to another. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're blaming her unhappiness on me? Is that your excuse?" Chris shook his head. "I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying, things weren't great between you two, and we connected. That's all." "Connected?" I laughed bitterly. "You destroyed my marriage, Chris. Do you even understand that? Or are you too busy being mom and dad's perfect little prince to care?" He looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. "Look, I know I screwed up, but maybe this is a sign. Maybe you and Clara weren't meant to be together." That was it. I swung before I even realized what I was doing. My fist connected with his jaw, and he stumbled back, cursing. "Don't you dare talk about what was meant to be," I growled, my voice shaking with fury. "You're a coward, Chris. A selfish, spineless coward." When I got home, Clara was waiting for me in the living room. She looked up from the couch, her face pale and drawn. "Where were you?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer. I walked to the mantel, grabbed the framed photo of our wedding, and held it up. "Does this mean anything to you anymore?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, please. Don't," I said sharply. "Don't you dare cry. You don't get to be the victim here." She stood, wringing her hands. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did." I said, my voice cold. You didn't just hurt me. You humiliated me. You betrayed me with my own brother. Clara's lip trembled, but she didn't deny it. It was a mistake, she whispered. I was lonely, and Chris, he was there. Lonely? I scoffed. You were lonely, so you decided to sleep with my brother? That's your excuse. She didn't respond. Tell me the truth, I said, stepping closer. Are you pregnant? Her silence was deafening. Clara, I shouted, my voice echoing in the quiet room. Is it his? She broke down, sobbing into her hands. I don't know, she choked out. I don't know. I stared at her, my anger turning into something colder. You don't know? Clara nodded, tears streaming down her face. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I couldn't stay in that house, not with her lies suffocating me. I drove aimlessly for hours before ending up at a motel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. I needed quiet. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mom. Mom, Chris says you're upset about something. Can we talk? I laughed bitterly. Of course, Chris had already spun the narrative, painting himself as the concerned brother. I didn't reply. 2 days later, I returned home to grab more of my things. Clara was gone, but her phone was sitting on the kitchen counter. For a moment, I considered smashing it, but curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked it and found a message thread with Chris. Chris, he knows. I think he's gonna tell Mom and Dad. Clara, what should we do? Chris, let me handle it. Don't say anything to anyone. I felt a surge of rage, but also a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about me and Clara anymore. This was about Chris, his lies, his manipulation, his willingness to throw me under the bus to protect himself. If he thought I was going to stay quiet, he didn't know me at all. I knew that confronting Chris and Clara in private wasn't enough. The betrayal was too deep, too personal to let it fade into family whispers. I needed the truth out in the open, for everyone to see Chris for who he truly was. But exposing him wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming the dignity he'd stolen from me, the life he'd dismantled while flashing that smug grin. I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. The perfect opportunity came during Sunday dinner at Mom and Dad's house. These dinners were a family tradition, the one constant in our chaotic lives. Everyone would be there. Mom, Dad, Chris, Clara, even our cousin Taylor, who never missed an excuse for free food. I spent the days leading up to it preparing. I printed screenshots of Clara's messages with Chris, along with the video I'd recorded of them at the park. I wasn't proud of my methods, but pride wasn't my priority anymore. I arrived early as usual. Mom greeted me with a hug, her eyes searching my face. You look tired, Ethan, she said. Long week, I replied, forcing a smile. Chris showed up late, as always, swaggering in with a bottle of wine. He grinned at Mom, kissed her cheek, and slapped me on the back like nothing had happened. Clara walked in behind him. She avoided my eyes, her face pale and tight. Dinner started like any other. Laughter, clinking glasses, and Chris dominating the conversation with one of his stories. So there I was, he said, gesturing wildly, stuck on the side of the road with a flat tire, and guess who stops to help? A Miss America contestant. Everyone laughed, even Clara. I clenched my fists under the table, waiting for the right moment. When dessert was served, I cleared my throat. Can I say something? I asked, my voice steady but firm. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to me. Of course, dear, Mom said, looking concerned. I stood, pulling a folder from my bag. My hands shook slightly, but I forced myself to meet their gazes. There's something I need to share with all of you. Something I've been keeping to myself for too long. Chris shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Ethan, is this really the time for? Yes, it is, I snapped, cutting him off. I placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing the printed messages and photos. Chris and Clara have been having an affair, I said, my voice cold and clear. And Clara is pregnant. The baby might be his. For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dad frowned, his face darkening. Taylor, ever the drama queen, muttered, "Holy shit," under her breath. Clara started crying, her face buried in her hands. Chris stood abruptly, knocking his chair over. "This is insane," he said, his voice rising. "Ethan, you're out of your mind." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. With a few taps, I played the video of them at the park. The room went deathly quiet as Chris and Clara appeared on the screen. Their smiles intimate, their body language impossible to misinterpret. Chris's face turned red. "This doesn't prove anything." I held up the screenshots next. "Then explain these texts," I said, my voice sharp. "Explain why you told Clara not to say anything. Explain why you were worried I'd tell Mom and Dad." Chris stammered, his usual charm evaporating. This isn't what it looks like." "Oh, really?" I said, stepping closer. "Then what is it, Chris? Because it sure as hell looks like you've been sleeping with my wife." Clara finally spoke, her voice shaky and broken. "Ethan, I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I never meant for this to happen." "Don't," I said, glaring at her. "You don't get to apologize. Not after what you've done." Mom started crying, her hands trembling as she looked between me and Chris. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Chris hesitated, his jaw clenching. "It's not like that," he said finally. "I made a mistake, okay? But it's not what you think." Dad slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. "Enough," he roared. "Chris, for once in your life, own up to what you've done." Chris flinched, his bravado crumbling. "Fine," he muttered. "Yes, it happened. But it didn't mean anything. It meant something to me," I shouted, my voice cracking. "It meant destroying my marriage, my trust, my entire life." The fallout was immediate. Mom broke down, sobbing into Dad's shoulder. Taylor started grilling Chris with rapid-fire questions, her voice dripping with disbelief. Clara ran out of the room, unable to face the chaos she'd caused. And Chris, he just stood there, looking lost and pathetic. "You've always been the favorite," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "But not this time. Not anymore. They know who you really are now." Chris opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. After that night, everything changed. Mom and Dad were furious with Chris, their golden boy finally tarnished. Clara tried to reach out to me, leaving tearful voicemails and apologetic texts, but I ignored them all. I filed for divorce the next day, and as far as I was concerned, Chris was no longer my brother. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe, but the scars were still there, deep and jagged. You'd think exposing the truth would bring some sense of relief, but it doesn't. Not right away. The weight of betrayal doesn't lift overnight. It settles deeper, carving grooves into your life where trust used to be. The days after the confrontation at Mom and Dad's were a blur of anger, sadness, and exhaustion. I moved out of the house the next day. I couldn't stand to be in the same space where so many lies had been told. Clara begged me to stay, tears streaming down her face as she stood in the doorway. "Please, Ethan," she cried, grabbing my arm. "I'll do anything to fix this." I looked at her, the woman I once loved, and felt nothing but a hollow ache. "You can't fix this," I said quietly, pulling away from her. Her sobs followed me as I loaded the last box into my car and drove off. The divorce process was brutal. Clara and I had no kids, no shared assets other than the house. But the emotional toll was enough to make every meeting with the lawyer feel like a battle. Chris, predictably, kept his distance. I didn't hear from him directly, but I knew from Mom that he was trying to spin the situation. "It was just a mistake," he told her. "Ethan's overreacting." But Mom wasn't buying it anymore. "He's not the man I thought he was," she said during one of our phone calls. Her voice trembled, a mix of sadness and anger. "Welcome to the club," I muttered. The family dynamic shifted completely. Chris had been their golden child for as long as I could remember, But now he was the outcast. Mom stopped inviting him to family dinners, and Dad refused to speak to him at all. Even Taylor, who usually thrived on drama, refused to engage with him. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one on the outside looking in. A few weeks after I left Clara, I got a call from her. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft and hesitant. "There's nothing to talk about," I said flatly. "Please, Ethan," she said. "It's important." I agreed to meet her, mostly out of curiosity. We met at a small coffee shop, the kind of place we used to visit when we were first dating. Clara looked tired, her face pale and drawn. She fidgeted with her coffee cup, avoiding my eyes. "I wanted to tell you in person," she said finally. "I got the paternity results." My heart thudded in my chest. "It's Chris's," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded slowly, the confirmation hitting me like a blow to the stomach. "I figured," I said, keeping my voice steady. Clara reached across the table, her eyes pleading. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I know I've ruined everything. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you." I pulled my hand away. "Don't," I said. "You don't get to say that." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Chris tried to reach out once, sending me a long-winded text about how sorry he was and how he wanted to make things right. I didn't respond. There was nothing he could say that would undo what he'd done. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into work, picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned, and started going to therapy. It wasn't easy, but it was better than letting the bitterness consume me. A few months later, I heard through Mom that Clara had given birth. A boy. Chris was in and out of the picture as I'd expected. He liked the idea of being a father more than the reality of it, and Clara was left to handle most of the responsibility on her own. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to gloat over their misery. But I didn't. I just felt tired. Mom and Dad tried to repair their relationship with me after everything that had happened. They apologized for the years of favoritism, for ignoring the ways Chris had hurt me long before this betrayal. "We should have seen it sooner," Mom said during one of our conversations. "It's done now," I said. "We can't change the past. But we can be better," Dad added. "And we will be." For once, I believed him. The first Thanksgiving after the fallout was different. Chris wasn't there, and Clara, obviously, was no longer part of the equation. It was quieter, more subdued, but for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I still carried the scars of what had happened, but they didn't define me anymore. Life doesn't stop for heartbreak. It trudges forward, indifferent to the pieces you're left holding. Over the months that followed, I learned how to live in the aftermath, how to rebuild, how to forgive myself for not seeing the betrayal sooner, and, most importantly, how to let go. But letting go wasn't easy. Not when reminders of Clara and Chris seemed to pop up everywhere. Family photos, shared memories, the odd comment from a coworker who didn't know better. The world didn't stop for my pain, but maybe that was a blessing. It forced me to keep moving, even when I didn't want to. My divorce from Clara was finalized in the spring. The house, once filled with her laughter and warmth, became mine alone. I sold it, unable to face the ghost of what we'd once had, and moved into a modest apartment downtown. I started fresh, furnishing it with items I'd picked out myself, things that had no connection to my past life. Felt good, in a way, to create something entirely my own. Therapy became a lifeline. My therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Holloway, didn't let me wallow in self-pity. "You've been hurt, Ethan," she said during one session. "But don't let that hurt define you. You're more than what happened to you." She was right. Slowly but surely, I began to believe it. Chris tried to make amends a few more times, but I ignored him. His apologies felt hollow, like he was more interested in alleviating his own guilt than truly making things right. Mom and Dad remained distant from him, their disappointment evident. The once favored son had become a pariah, and while part of me felt vindicated, another part felt hollow. I didn't want to celebrate his downfall. I just wanted him out of my life. Clara, on the other hand, respected my boundaries. She sent me one final letter after the divorce, apologizing again and thanking me for the years we'd shared. "I'll never forgive myself for what I did to you," she wrote. "But I hope one day you'll find someone who loves you the way you deserve to be loved." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Months turned into a year, and the pain began to dull. I found joy in small things: an early morning run, a good book, a cup of coffee on the balcony. I reconnected with old friends, started volunteering at a local shelter, and even went on a few dates. One of those dates turned into something more. Her name was Rachel, a teacher with a sharp wit and an infectious laugh. We met at a charity event and hit it off immediately. Rachel was nothing like Clara. She was warm, open, and fiercely independent. There was no pretense with her, no games or hidden agendas. She made me laugh, something I hadn't done in what felt like years. We took things slow, but for the first time in a long time I felt hopeful. The holidays came around again, and I found myself back at Mom and Dad's for Christmas dinner. Chris wasn't there, and neither was Clara. The house felt different without them, quieter, but not in a bad way. Mom pulled me aside after dinner, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so proud of you, Ethan," she said, squeezing my hand. "For what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "For how you've handled all of this," she said. "You've been so strong, so resilient. I wish I could take back all the years we made you feel less than you are." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "Thanks, Mom," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Later that night, as I drove home, I thought about everything I'd been through: the betrayal, the pain, the anger. It hadn't been easy, and there were still moments when the scars felt fresh. But I realized something important. I'd survived. Chris and Clara's betrayal had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I was still standing, still moving forward, and for the first time in a long time I felt free. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I was ready to face it, one step at a time.